you have Mark 11 open, you might find that useful. And the passage we have in front of us is relevant to all churches. We thought about Catholic and Apostolic. All churches at all times, for every Christian of all places at all times, this is relevant, and no less for us here at CPC. Of course, that's always true of everything we look at. But think about how we self-describe ourselves as a church here. We'd say that we are evangelical. That means that we believe the Bible, even when we don't really want to, when it's awkward for us to believe in the Bible. We take God at his word, as we've just sung. We are what some churches call confessional, which means that we're helped. We don't just think what do I think the Bible means? We're helped by all of history. The Catholic Apostolic thing again. We have these historic documents that help us So we're not just looking at the Bible by ourselves, but what the global historic church has thought. So that means we're not just making things up that suit us, nor what's more comfortable that fits in the time and is less offensive. Neither are we just going through things out of tradition. We're just going through these motions because that's what we do. We actually believe this stuff. That's on one hand. On the other hand, we don't want to be needlessly conservative, and we don't want to be unwelcoming to anyone that comes along. And talking to people, that's often why they say they come here. Something about our attitude to the Bible and something to do with our attitude to people. And so none of that, I'd also suggest, is unique to us. We're not the only churches like that. Nor does it mean there's not room to improve anywhere. But obviously we think we've struck a balance. And we're just trying, aren't we, to get it right. I think that probably sums us up. And that's a dangerous position to be in. That's right, all those things, but it's not. It still puts us in a precarious position. And last week we saw Jesus comes in salvation and judgment. That's how Mark starts his gospel, and we started seeing that last week. And last week we focused on salvation, and this week focuses on judgment. Specifically here, judgment on hollow religion. Beware of hollow religion. Now, as I say those words, probably in your mind there is a picture already of what we mean by hollow religion. But I want to warn us that it comes in many guises, and hollow religion to work has to be well camouflaged. Any kind of church, any kind of Christian can produce it, and we need to be aware that we are not immune to it. Hollow religion often looks promising and attractive, but it doesn't bear the fruit that God is looking for. So last week we had this dramatic scenes of Jesus entering Jerusalem with the crowd cheering, and it ends rather flat. Verse 11, where we started the reading this morning. And he entered Jerusalem and went into the temple, and he looked around at everything. And as it was late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. It builds up and goes through. But it's one of several times in Mark's gospel where it says Jesus looked around. Jesus looked around, and every time he does, he assesses the situation, and he comes to a negative judgment. So he takes in the evidence, he weighs it, and he comes to a right and just judgment, but a negative one. Now, this passage has two scenes in it, and they inform each other. The judgment on the fig tree and the cleansing of the temple. And they both warn us about good-looking but superficial Christianity. So first, let's look at the fig tree. You'll find that in verses 12 to 14 and verses 20 to 21. Now, if you remember, we said that Mark likes these sandwiches. So what Mark does is he has a main point with supporting points around them. So you've got the tasty bit in the middle and some bread around it. And here, the fig tree is either side of the temple event. Now, actually, it's part of a mega sandwich, which is all of chapter 11. So we haven't got the rest of chapter 11 yet, but the start and the end of chapter 11 is about Jesus's authority. So it starts with his authority celebrated, and it ends with his authority rejected. Then we have about the figs, and then we have in the middle the temple. So what happens is Jesus is hungry, and he goes to get a fig. There is none, and so he curses the tree. And you think, What's the fig tree done wrong? It sounds like a stroppy toddler tantrum. And especially the end of verse 13, because apparently it's not even the right season for fruit. So you think that's not fair at all. It's not even meant to have fruit there. So why is Jesus getting so annoyed? It's the only negative miracle in the gospel. All other gospels are restoring. This is a destroying one. It's the only one. It is an acted parable. Jesus says these verbal parables. This is an acted parable. Because fig trees in the prophets are an image of Israel. And at the heart of Israel is the temple. And so these images in the prophets are of Israel as a fig tree bearing fruit or not bearing fruit. Now notice this sandwich has got a bit of a pattern. So if you look at verse 11, Jesus looked at the temple. Verses 12 to 13, Jesus looked at the fig tree. Verse 14, Jesus condemned the fig tree. Verses 15 to 19, Jesus condemned the temple. And verse 20, the fig tree withered. And verse 21, there's a sort of question in the air, will the temple wither? As the prophets warned it might. And we go on to see later in Mark it will, in fact, more catastrophic than just withering. So why is it significant that Jesus does not find figs at the very time you should not find figs? Well, figs usually start to fruit before the leaves come out. I used to have a fig tree in my garden. I bought it in our last house, had it in a pot. And in the, I think, 20 years nearly of having it, it bore 2 figs. England is not a place to grow figs. So they don't quite work here. But in the Middle East, in places where figs are meant to grow, the figs grow before the leaves. But so if you see leaves, that means there's fruit already there. It should have already fruited. So some fruit early, and the leaves indicate there's early fruit. And so it's not unreasonable to see a leafy tree and assume there's some figs on it. You just think, just my day, isn't it? I didn't think at this time of year we'd get some figs, but it looks like I'm in luck. And sometimes you are. But also sometimes fig trees leaf early and there are no fruit, which seems to be the case here. Our fig trees always produce leaves and never produced fruit. Of the 2 fruit it produced, one time our dog ate it and the other time we had a toddler that threw it in the bin or something. So this is what's happening here. Jesus goes, there's no fruit. And as we'll see, this is an image of Israel in Jesus' day. And it's a warning to the individual Christian and the church in our day. It can look leafy and green and alive and lush, and therefore not unreasonable to think that it's a fruit-bearing church or a fruit-bearing Christian, and then to find no fruit, just leaves. Just the external signs of life, but no substance. Lots of activities and or presented well, but it doesn't have the fruit that God desires. I was talking to a man recently from a different part of the country, and he's changed churches recently, and part of there's a pull to the church he's gone, but the push away from his old church was that the previous church, he was very involved in the youth work. He was leading it. And but he was not allowed to share the gospel with anyone that the youth brought along, any non-Christians that the youth brought along, for 6 months. So they'd be embedded. And there were various no-go subjects. And he was very limited in what he was allowed to do from the Bible. The message was just get them in, just get as many people in as we can. And so he left. He said, I'd rather just have a handful, very small number, looking at the Bible and bearing fruit. And actually, I've heard that story, a variation of it, many, many times over many, many years. And for us, it's important as well. So it's very easy to go, well, yeah, we've heard of that. But for us, we can easily lose our nerve because we all like the leaves. But there's a question, are we bearing fruit? And are we bearing the fruit that Jesus wants? Now, what is that fruit? We will come to that soon. But first, we're going to switch scenes to the temple in verses 15 to 19. So this is the sandwich filling. notice when we're talking about being more Christ-like, flipping tables is a possibility. And notice verse 17, Mark calls it teaching. So any teachers here, perhaps that you can relate to that, teaching by the flipping of tables. But what happens here? Look at verses 15 to 16. And they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple, and he began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. So why did he do that? And was what they're doing wrong in and of itself? Actually, it makes some sense what they were doing. People were coming from all over the known world, mostly from around the Roman Empire, but some from outside. And the temple demanded a certain currency, and you needed to exchange it. Worship involved animal sacrifice, and it wouldn't be practical for most pilgrims to bring an animal that far. There were markets on the Mount of Olives that Jesus just walked up where you could buy animals there. And in the past, that's what pilgrims did. They would walk to Jerusalem through the Mount of Olives, buy your animal, take it to the temple. But there's always a risk that when you bring an animal in, the priest might find fault in it and it's not an appropriate sacrifice. So these animals are the pre-approved sacrificial animals. So what's Jesus' problems? You need the money changers, you need the animals. The problem's verse 17. He was teaching them and saying to them, "Is it not written, my house should be called a house of prayer for all the nations? But you have made it a den of robbers." Now he's quoting two bits from the Old Testament. He's quoting Isaiah 56:7 and Jeremiah 7:11. And when the New Testament quotes the Old Testament, best think of those verses as a hyperlink. You know, when you get an email or you look in the website and you get a word, usually in blue and underlined, and you click it and you get a load more text. That's what New Testament writers are doing. That's what Jesus is doing. You're meant to know where Isaiah 56 and Jeremiah 7 is and what they say. So Jeremiah 56:6 says, "My house should be called a house of prayer for the nations." So a house of prayer for whom? Well, if you start reading from, I've done this work for you, but so you don't have to, but if you start reading from Isaiah 56, it tells us eunuchs and foreigners, people from the nations, those who keep God's Sabbath. So those who are trusting him and responding in obedience, but people who would have been excluded from the temple before are now to come. Now, the bits in the Old Testament, there's a little bit we looked at the other week in Numbers. There's but lots in places like Leviticus, where certain people are excluded either temporarily or for good. And when we've looked at those, we see that it's a teaching aid about purity and about nothing deathy coming into the temple, because the temple is a kind of snapshot of the future of the new creation. But Isaiah and others promise that this is not always going to be so, that the temple is not an end in itself. And the aim is that anyone can be included into God's family by faith, that God will make them fit to meet with him. The promise that one day they too will come in to his people. But the Israel of Jesus' day had no heart for those people. They, if you remember the previous weeks, we're to welcome the little ones, the least and the last and the lost, those who are on the outside, that we're not to keep them out. But the Israel of Jesus' day are not interested in that. And likely the location where the money changing and the animal purchases is happening is in the call to the Gentiles, because there's no other room to have it. So just by the location of the activities, the Gentiles are excluded. So Israel are God's chosen people, but that is not an end in itself. They're meant to be a light to the nations. But they actually not that bothered about the nations. They're quite happy to have them excluded. Then Jeremiah 7:11, you've made it a den of robbers. Again, click the hyperlink. It doesn't mean that the market sellers are robbing the worshippers. That's how often we assume it. Click on the hyperlink, Jeremiah 7, it means robbing God. Much more serious. How? Well, what Jeremiah talks about is not honouring God as they should and presuming on God. And they say, the temple, the temple, the temple. So they run the temple and therefore think that they're bulletproof. They think that excuses everything. They just go to the temple and everything will be fine. Even excusing gross sin and idolatry. Of course, there's versions of Christianity like that. So those two aspects are the fruit that Israel is not bearing. So in many ways, the temple worship looked healthy. The temple authorities made sure it all happened properly and that the buildings were well maintained. But they have no heart for the lost, the little, and the least. And they're presuming on God, therefore robbing him. You see, we all need saving. We can't do it through our hollow religion. And so when we look at the lost and the least, they are no better than us. And we can't presume on our hollow religion. We need the gospel. We need grace. And that produces this fruit of not presuming on God and showing welcome to the other little ones along with us. So when Peter sees the fig tree, he observes that it's withered. And it begs the question, will the temple in Israel wither too? And Jesus' complete answer to that comes in chapter 13, which we'll look at in the future. There'll be a great judgment on the temple and on Jewish religion. And so there is a warning, though, to us. What is the fruit that God wants from us? Now, I've not heard this said for a while, but I used to hear it a lot when I was younger. Oh, that church has great worship. That church, you go there, great worship. And what does that mean? And it depends on who said it, but it means something like this. The music I like well executed, or well put together liturgy. Now, exactly what I mean by that is different on the person. I don't know you can say that, can you? You can't say that church has good worship unless you have a window into their heart. Because what is happening between them and God? I don't know. But are they bearing the fruit he requires? And they might be, and at the same time, their worship service is a ding of ordinary chaos, of organised chaos. It is not for each of us to grade what happens, but to examine ourselves and our place in the whole. Do we have a heart for the lost, the little, and the least? Do we pray for them? Do we support mission towards those who we won't be able to reach? Are we actively seeking to share the gospel and bring them in? And when the awkward turn up, and the awkward is different for each of us, who we find personally awkward, when they turn up, how do we feel about that? And there is an irony that I keep on seeing. I'm not looking at one here, but I do find in various places of those who criticize about judgmentalism can be the most judgmental. Don't be that guy. And the other risk is presumption, because we are the nice ones, as we keep being told. We are the sound ones. We try and do things by this book. We are the generous ones. And yes, that's all good and right. But then we rob God, presuming that gives us a free pass, or that we're just concerned about the leaves and not the fruit. What we see and like and we think others might like, but doesn't cross, well, what does God think? It doesn't matter what others think. What does God think? The modern church and the modern Christian faces exactly the same risks that Israel of Jesus' day faced. We look for the leaves, the things that people can measure and observe and see. And it's understandable because you can see them and observe them and measure them. But God looks for something deeper. He looks for fruit. He looks on the heart. He looks on our substance. Do we actively seek and welcome the little, the last, and the lost? and not to presume on our own status, but receive from him mercy with open arms. Let's pray.